Imagine being so wealthy that you could literally buy the Pope, not metaphorically, literally purchase the highest position in Christianity. Well, meet the Medici family, who didn't just buy one pope, they bought four. A family of bankers so rich, so cunning, so powerful, that kings and popes lined up like peasants at their door, begging for loans. But before we expose all their dirty secrets, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because if you love stories about power, money, and Renaissance drama, you're in exactly the right place. Let's start with Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici in the late 1300s. Now, the Medicis weren't exactly peasants, they were already in banking. But Giovanni had a brilliant realization. Instead of just counting other people's money, why not control all the money? Giovanni figured out that real power doesn't come from sheep, it comes from money. And the best way to make money? Banking. Here's where it gets juicy. The Catholic Church had this little problem. They officially forbade charging interest on loans because it was considered sinful. But the church also needed massive amounts of cash to fund its operations. Enter Giovanni, with the financial equivalent of a magic trick. He created exchange rates that were so creatively calculated, they were basically interest in disguise. The church got its money, Giovanni got rich, and everyone pretended usury wasn't happening. The Medici weren't just holding money, they were laundering it for God himself. They became the official bankers of the Catholic Church. Every indulgence, every tithe, every offering flowing into Rome passed through Medici's hands. That's right, the road to heaven was paved with Medici gold. By the 1420s, the Medici Bank had branches across Europe: London, Bruges, Naples, Rome, basically anywhere there was serious money to be made. They weren't just bankers, they were the bank. When kings needed cash for wars, they called the Medicis. When merchants needed trade financing, they called the Medicis. When the Pope needed to build another cathedral, guess who picked up the phone? The Medicis. But Giovanni wasn't just stacking coins, he was stacking allies. He married well, bribed better, and made sure the family had their fingers in every political pie in Florence. But here's the scandal nobody talks about. Giovanni's son, Cosimo, took daddy's business model and weaponized it. He realized that when you control the money supply, you control everything else too. Cosimo di Medici was like a Renaissance era combination of Jeff Bezos and Tony Soprano. This man turned financial services into a political weapon so sophisticated that it would make modern lobbyists weep with envy. Here's his genius move. Instead of running for office himself, Cosimo would simply loan money to politicians. Then, when they couldn't pay back, which was always, he'd forgive the debt in exchange for political favors. Suddenly, half the Florentine government owed their careers to him. It was like having the entire city council in your pocket, except perfectly legal. But the other wealthy families in Florence weren't stupid. They saw what Cosimo was doing and tried to stop him. In 1433, they actually succeeded in having him exiled for threatening the public. Cosimo's response? He took all his money with him. All of it. Within a year, Florence's economy was in free fall. And guess who got invited back with a hero's welcome? The man was so petty that when he returned, he had his enemies exiled instead. But here's the beautiful part. He didn't just banish them, he used his banking network to make sure they couldn't get loans anywhere in Europe. Imagine being blacklisted from every bank from London to Constantinople because you annoyed one guy in Florence. That's not just revenge. That's art. Cosimo also figured out something crucial. If you want to control culture, you fund culture. He became the patron of artists, philosophers, and architects, not out of the goodness of his heart, but because intellectuals shape public opinion. When Donatello creates a masterpiece with your money, suddenly you're not just a banker. You're a visionary supporting human achievement. It's Renaissance era PR, and it was brilliant. Now, every dynasty has its golden age, and for the Medici, that was Lorenzo de' Medici, better known as Lorenzo the Magnificent. This man took everything his grandfather started and cranked it up to 11. Lorenzo wasn't just wealthy, he was Renaissance Italy's equivalent of a rock star, philosopher king, and mafia don, all rolled into one incredible charismatic package. Lorenzo's Florence became the center of the Renaissance not by accident, but by design. He created what was essentially the world's first arts incubator. Young Michelangelo, Lorenzo discovered him and basically adopted him. The guy lived in the Medici palace and ate dinner with the family. Imagine having Michelangelo as your house guest, casually sculpting masterpieces in your backyard. But here's where it gets scandalous. Lorenzo was funding all this art and philosophy while simultaneously running what amounted to a protection racket. He had spies throughout Italy, maintained private armies, and wasn't above having inconvenient people disappear. The most infamous? The Pazzi conspiracy. Rival bankers, the Pazzi family, teamed up with Pope Sixtus IV to kill Lorenzo and his brother during Easter Mass in 1478. Imagine this: the cathedral packed with worshippers, assassins hiding in the crowd, and suddenly, blood on the altar. Lorenzo's brother, Giuliano, was stabbed 19 times and died in a pool of blood. Lorenzo himself escaped with just a cut. Lorenzo unleashed a revenge so brutal it would make The Godfather look like a Disney film. Conspirators were hanged from the windows of the Palazzo Vecchio. The Pope threatened excommunication. Florence threatened war. And somehow, Lorenzo came out even more powerful. This was the Medici style: survive every scandal and come back stronger. The most insane part? Lorenzo was simultaneously negotiating with foreign powers, essentially conducting his own foreign policy independent of Florence's official government. He prevented multiple wars through sheer diplomatic genius and economic leverage. When the Pope allied with Naples to attack Florence, Lorenzo personally traveled to Naples and somehow convinced the king to switch sides. Now, what do you do when you're just too rich to just run a city? You run the church. The Medici produced not one, not two, but 4 popes. And let's just say, these weren't exactly saints. This is where the Medici story goes from impressive to absolutely bonkers. Lorenzo's son Giovanni became Pope Leo X in 1513. And suddenly, the family didn't just have money and political power, they had divine authority. But Giovanni wasn't content with just being Pope. He wanted to turn the papacy into a family business. Here's a scandal that would make tabloid writers weep with joy. Pope Leo X threw parties so lavish that they nearly bankrupted the Vatican. We're talking about papal orgies, hunting expeditions with hundreds of guests, and theatrical performances that cost more than most kingdoms' annual budgets. The man allegedly said, "Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." But the real scandal? Leo X started selling indulgences, basically get-out-of-hell free cards, to fund his lifestyle and pet projects, including the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica. This practice was so corrupt that it literally caused the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther nailed his complaints to a church door, specifically because he was outraged by Medici papal corruption. The Medicis accidentally broke Christianity in half because they wanted nicer art and better parties. Then came the next generation of Medici popes. Giovanni's cousin Giulio became Pope Clement VII and managed to be even more politically disastrous. During his reign, Rome was literally sacked by foreign armies because of his diplomatic incompetence. The Pope had to flee in disguise as a merchant while his city burned. It would be hilarious if it wasn't so tragic. But here's the thing. Even after accidentally causing the Reformation and watching Rome burn, the Medicis kept getting elected pope. The Medici popes weren't saving souls. They were securing power, building palaces, and keeping the family fortune flowing. They had turned corruption into such a fine art that people just accepted it as normal. That's not just political skill. That's creating an entirely new standard for acceptable behavior. By the 16th century, the Medicis had outgrown Italy entirely. Through strategic marriages and financial manipulation, they had relatives ruling across Europe. Catherine de' Medici became Queen of France and mother to 3 French kings. That's right, the Italian banking family was literally running France. Catherine's story alone could fill 10 scandals. She was accused of poisoning political opponents, practicing witchcraft, and orchestrating the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where thousands of Protestants were killed in a single night. Whether she was actually responsible or just a convenient scapegoat for male politicians' failures is debatable. Still, her reputation was so fearsome that Medici became synonymous with political ruthlessness across Europe. Meanwhile, back in Florence, the later Medicis were turning their city-state into the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. Cosimo I de' Medici essentially crowned himself a noble and began conquering neighboring territories. The banking family had become royalty through sheer audacity and superior financial planning. By the late 1600s, the Medicis were Grand Dukes of Tuscany, with multiple family members who had been pope, controlled trade routes across the Mediterranean, and had royal connections throughout Europe. They had created a shadow empire that had influenced European politics for over 3 centuries. Why do the Medicis matter? Because they weren't just rich, they changed the course of European history. So, what made the Medicis different from every other wealthy family in history? They understood something that most people still don't get. Money isn't power, control is power. They didn't just accumulate wealth. They created systems that made everyone else dependent on them. They turned banking into politics, politics into culture, and culture into religion. They funded the Renaissance, not out of altruism, but because controlling art and ideas was the ultimate long-term investment. Every Michelangelo sculpture, every Brunelleschi dome, every philosophical treatise, it all served to legitimize and perpetuate Medici influence. The craziest part? Their strategy worked so well that we still celebrate them today. We remember them as patrons of the arts and supporters of human achievement, not as the ruthless oligarchs who bought and sold governments like commodities. That's not just successful image management, that's rewriting history itself. The Medici dynasty lasted from the 1400s to the 1700s, over 3 centuries of continuous power and influence. They survived wars, plagues, political upheavals, and religious reformations. Why? Because they never put all their eggs in one basket. When banking became less profitable, they moved into politics. When politics got dangerous, they bought religious authority. When local power wasn't enough, they went international. They were the ultimate hedge fund, diversified across centuries, industries, and countries. And unlike most dynasties that collapsed when their particular form of power became obsolete, the Medicis kept evolving, kept adapting, and kept winning. The last Medici died in 1743, but their influence shaped the modern world. The Renaissance they funded created the intellectual foundation for the Enlightenment. The banking practices they pioneered became the basis for modern international finance. The political strategies they perfected are still used by power brokers today. So the next time you swipe your credit card, remember, you're just playing a game the Medici invented 600 years ago. If you enjoyed this dive into the Renaissance's richest, most scandalous family, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to Epic Renaissance, and ring that bell so you don't miss our next darkly delicious tale from history.